The first thing Sarah Martinez noticed wasn't the screaming or the shattered glass, it was the smell. Cordite and fear, metallic and sharp, cutting through the vanilla air freshener that the First National Bank of Cedar Falls had been pumping through their vents for the past decade. Her hand froze halfway to her wallet, muscle memory from 2 tours in Afghanistan, recognizing the scent of violence before her conscious mind could process what was happening. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Everyone on the ground. Now, this is not a drill. The voice belonged to a man in a black ski mask standing near the teller windows, and a Reef 15 clutched in hands that shook just enough to make Sarah's trained eye catalog him as amateur dangerous in his unpredictability. Behind him, 2 more figures moved with slightly more precision, one guarding the door while the other vaulted over the counter with practiced ease. 3 total. Sarah's assessment was automatic, instinctive, honed by years of training that had saved her life in Kandahar and Helmand Province. She dropped to her knees like everyone else, her weathered hiking boots silent against the marble floor, but her mind remained standing. The elderly woman beside her, Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop on Main Street, was crying silently, her arthritic hands trembling as she clutched her purse. To Sarah's left, a young father held his toddler close, the little boy's Mickey Mouse shirt bright against his father's protective embrace. Phones on the floor. All of them. Sarah's iPhone clattered against the marble, but her eyes never stopped moving. Exit strategies, cover positions, sight lines. The bank's layout mapped itself in her mind like a tactical briefing. 2 exits. Main entrance now blocked by gunman 2, and the employee exit behind the teller line that led to the parking lot. Bulletproof glass separated the teller area from the lobby, but it was down now, the partition raised for the afternoon shift change. The lead robber, Sarah dubbed him Alpha in her mind, was shouting at the bank manager, a soft-spoken man named George Brennan, whom Sarah had known since she'd moved to Cedar Falls 3 years ago. George's face had gone the color of old newspaper, sweat beading on his forehead despite the October chill that had followed Sarah into the building. The vault. Open it now or people start dying. George's hands shook as he fumbled with his keys. I need 2 keys. The assistant manager, she's in the back office. Sarah's peripheral vision caught movement, a security guard she hadn't noticed before. Probably retired police, reaching slowly for his sidearm. Her heart rate spiked not with fear, but with tactical urgency. He was going to get people killed. Without thinking, she caught his eye and gave the slightest shake of her head. Something in her expression, the steady calm that had kept her squad alive through 3 IED attacks and a helicopter crash, made him freeze. His hand fell away from his weapon. Sarah? The voice was soft, confused. She turned to see Jennifer Walsh, one of the tellers, crouched behind the counter. They'd talked dozens of times during Sarah's regular banking visits. Conversations about Jennifer's nursing school classes and Sarah's work with the local veterans group. "Sarah, what do we do?" The question cut through the chaos like a prayer. What do we do? It was the same question her soldiers had asked her during the ambush outside Kabul, when the world had dissolved into gunfire and dust and the screaming of wounded Marines. Then, she'd had her M4 and her training and the backing of the United States military. Now she had nothing but the same training and 23 innocent people whose lives hung in the balance. Alpha was getting impatient, his voice rising to a near shriek. "Move faster. We've got 5 minutes before the cops show up. 5 minutes." Sarah's mind automatically began calculating response times. Cedar Falls was small enough that the police station was maybe 3 minutes away, but it was Tuesday afternoon, and half the force would be at the elementary school for their weekly safety demonstration. The sheriff's department was another 10 minutes out. If these men knew local patrol schedules and their 5-minute timeline suggested they might, They were working with inside information or had done serious reconnaissance. The assistant manager, a nervous woman in her 50s named Carol Winters, emerged from the back office with tears streaming down her face. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold her key. Together, she and George began the process of opening the vault, their movements mechanical, robotic, divorced from the terror that surrounded them. Sarah noticed details others missed. The way Gunman 2 kept checking his watch, the slight bulge in Alpha's jacket pocket that suggested a second weapon, the fact that Gunman 3 had cable ties hanging from his belt. This wasn't a smash-and-grab robbery. They'd planned for hostages. "Please," whispered Mrs. Henderson beside her. "Please, I just want to see my granddaughter again." The old woman's words hit Sarah like shrapnel. Mrs. Henderson had lost her husband in Vietnam, had spent 40 years tending his memory with flowers and devotion. Her granddaughter, Emma, was 8 years old and the light of her life. Every Tuesday, Mrs. Henderson came to the bank to deposit the small checks from her pension, then walked 3 blocks to Emma's school to volunteer in the library. Emma would be expecting her in 20 minutes. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. These men had chosen the wrong bank, the wrong day, the wrong town. They'd certainly chosen the wrong woman to threaten. The vault door swung open with a hydraulic hiss that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet lobby. Alpha gestured with his rifle, and Carol stumbled inside, beginning to load stacks of bills into the duffel bags the robbers had brought. Sarah estimated they'd get maybe $40,000, hardly enough to justify the federal charges they were racking up. But then again, desperate people rarely made good mathematicians. "Faster!" Alpha barked, and Sarah saw his finger tighten on the trigger. That's when she made her decision. It wasn't the heroic moment movies made it out to be. There was no swelling music, no dramatic internal monologue. It was simply the recognition that she had skills these men didn't know she possessed, and innocent people who needed those skills deployed. Her former squad leader had always said that being a Marine wasn't about the uniform, it was about standing between evil and the innocent. No matter where you found yourself. Sarah was still a Marine. She'd just been running errands. She began to shift her weight, preparing for movement, when Jennifer's voice cut through her planning. "Please don't hurt anyone," the young teller called out. "We're doing everything you asked." Alpha turned toward the sound, his weapon swinging around, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. These weren't career criminals or desperate addicts looking for a quick score. There was something else there, a wildness that suggested they'd already decided how this was going to end. The third gunman, who'd been silent until now, spoke for the first time. "We've got company." Through the bank's large windows, Sarah could see a Cedar Falls police cruiser pulling into the parking lot, not responding to an alarm, just routine patrol. Officer Danny Morrison, she realized, probably stopping in to check on things, as he did twice a week. Danny was a good cop, but young, maybe 26, with a wife and a baby on the way. "Shit," Alpha hissed. This wasn't supposed to happen for another 3 minutes. Gunman 2 raised his weapon toward the window. "I can drop him before he gets out of the car." "No." The word came from Sarah before she could stop herself. Every head in the bank turned toward her, including the 3 masked faces of the robbers. Alpha's rifle swung around to point directly at her chest, and for a moment the only sound in the bank was the quiet hum of the air conditioning and Mrs. Henderson's terrified breathing. "What did you say?" Sarah looked up at him, her dark eyes steady and calm. "I said no. You shoot a cop, and this goes from armed robbery to capital murder. Every law enforcement agency in the state will be hunting you. You'll never make it out of town." Alpha took a step closer, the barrel of his rifle now inches from Sarah's face. "You think you're in charge here, lady?" "I think you're scared," Sarah said quietly. "And scared people make mistakes. You don't want to make a mistake." The words hung in the air like smoke. Outside, Officer Morrison was climbing out of his patrol car, completely unaware of the drama unfolding inside the bank. Sarah could see him adjusting his duty belt, probably planning to come in and chat with George about the upcoming high school football game. Alpha's breathing was rapid, audible even through his mask. "You don't know anything about what I want. I know you planned this for when the police would be busy at the school," Sarah continued, her voice steady and conversational. "I know you knew about the shift change that would lower the bulletproof glass. I know you've been watching this place long enough to know the security protocols. That's not the behavior of someone who wants to add cop killing to his resume." "Gunman." 3 checked his watch again. "We need to move, now." Through the window, Officer Morrison was walking toward the bank's entrance, his radio crackling with routine traffic. In maybe 30 seconds, he'd push through those doors and find himself in a hostage situation he wasn't prepared for. Sarah made her choice. "There's a back exit through the employee area," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the lobby. "You can be out of here before he even knows you were inside. Take your money and go. Everyone lives, including you." Alpha stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah could practically hear the gears turning in his head. He was smart enough to recognize good advice when he heard it, even from a hostage. "How do I know you're not lying?" "Because if I'm lying, you'll know in about 15 seconds, and then you can shoot me." Sarah's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. "But if I'm right, you get to walk away from this." The bank's front door chimed as Officer Morrison pushed it open, his hand resting casually on his radio. He took 2 steps inside before he noticed the unusual silence, the way every customer and employee was on the floor. "Cedar Falls PD." He called out, his hand moving to his weapon. "Everyone stay down." But the bank was empty of threats. The 3 robbers had vanished through the employee exit, their duffel bags full of cash, leaving behind only the lingering smell of fear and the sound of 23 people breathing again as the adrenaline began to fade, and the reality of what had just happened settled over the bank. Sarah remained kneeling on the marble floor, her mind already turning over the details, cataloging the things that didn't add up. The robbers' knowledge of police schedules, the precision of their timing, the way they'd known exactly when the bulletproof glass would be down. Someone had helped them plan this. Someone local. And something told her this wasn't over. The Cedar Falls Police Department smelled like burnt coffee and the lingering ghost of cigarettes from the days when smoking indoors was still legal. Sarah sat in an uncomfortable metal chair across from Detective Ray Coleman, a man whose weathered face spoke of 30 years dealing with the darker side of their small town. His questions had been thorough but routine, the same ones he'd asked the other witnesses over the past 3 hours. "So you just happen to know about police patrol schedules and bank security protocols?" Coleman's voice carried the weary skepticism of a cop who'd heard every story twice. "I notice patterns," Sarah replied, accepting the styrofoam cup of terrible coffee he offered. "It's what kept me alive overseas." "Military background, right?" "Army, 2 tours overseas." Coleman made a note on his yellow pad. "And you've been in Cedar Falls for 3 years, working with the VA? Veterans Group. We meet at the community center every Thursday. Help folks navigate disability claims, job placement, that kind of thing." Sarah took a sip of the coffee and managed not to wince. "Detective Coleman, those men knew too much about the bank's operations. This wasn't a random robbery." The detective leaned back in his chair, studying her with eyes that had seen too much. "You think someone local was feeding them information?" It wasn't a question, and Sarah appreciated that he was taking her seriously. In her experience, small-town cops either dismissed outsiders entirely or welcomed their input based on their own insecurities. Coleman seemed like neither type, just a professional doing his job. "The timing was too perfect," she said. "They knew about the shift change, the police schedule, Probably even the amount of cash that would be in the vault on a Tuesday afternoon. That's inside information. Coleman nodded slowly. We're looking into that. In the meantime, I need you to understand that what you did in there, it was brave, but it was also incredibly dangerous. You could have gotten everyone killed. Sarah had heard variations of this lecture before, usually from superior officers who hadn't been in the field when decisions had to be made in real time. With respect, detective, those men were already planning to hurt people. I could see it in their body language, their positioning. They brought cable ties and chose a time when the bank would be full of customers. This wasn't going to end quietly, no matter what anyone did or didn't do. Maybe you escalated a situation that could have been resolved without anyone getting hurt. The criticism stung because Sarah had been asking herself the same question for the past 3 hours. The rules had been clearer in combat zones. Here, in the marble lobby of a small-town bank, the lines had been blurred beyond recognition. I made the best decision I could with the information I had, she said finally. Same as always. Coleman closed his notebook and stood up. You're free to go. We'll need you to come in tomorrow to look at some photos, see if you can identify any of the suspects. Sarah nodded and headed for the door, but Coleman's voice stopped her. Mrs. Martinez? That thing you did keeping Jenkins from drawing his weapon? You probably saved his life. And maybe a few others too. The October sun was setting as Sarah walked out of the police station, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of the sunsets over the mountains outside. Kabul, she'd always loved this time of day. The quiet transition between the business of afternoon and the rest of evening. But today the approaching darkness felt ominous. Her truck, a battered Ford F-150 she'd bought used when she first moved to Cedar Falls, sat in the visitor parking area like an old friend. The bed was filled with supplies for the Veterans Group donated clothing, a box of paperback novels, and a case of the protein bars that had become a staple of their Thursday meetings. Simple things that made complex lives a little easier. Drive home took her through the heart of Cedar Falls, a town of 8,000 people nestled in a valley between rolling hills that turned brilliant colors every autumn. Main Street looked like something from a Norman Rockwell painting antique shops and a hardware store that had been in the same family for 4 generations. The movie theater with its Art Deco marquee advertising the latest superhero film, Henderson's. Flowers with its cheerful yellow, a WNINGS dot. Sarah had chosen Cedar Falls for its quiet streets and neighbors, who waved from their front porches, a pace of life that allowed for healing, or so she'd thought. Her house sat on Maple Street, a modest 2-bedroom craftsman with a front porch that had sold her the moment she'd seen it. The previous owner, an elderly widow named Mrs. Patterson, had maintained it with the kind of care that spoke of decades of love. Sarah had kept most of the woman's garden, learning to tend the roses and vegetable plots that changed with the seasons. The interior was sparse but comfortable furniture from the thrift shop on Route 9, books from the library's annual sale, photographs from her time in the service mixed with landscapes she'd taken during her weekend hikes in the state park. The only expensive items were her firearms, kept in a gun safe in the spare bedroom that had been converted into a home office. Sarah opened a beer and stepped onto the back porch, looking out over the small yard where she'd planted herbs and tomatoes. The normalcy of it, the mundane routine of coming home, opening a beer, checking on her garden felt surreal after the day's events. 6 hours ago, she'd been planning to deposit her veteran's disability check and pick up groceries. Now she was the central witness in an armed robbery that had every hallmark of an inside job. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Walsh. Thank you for what you did today. I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if you hadn't been there. Sarah stared at the message for a long time before responding. Just glad everyone's okay. How are you holding up? The reply came quickly, scared. Keep thinking I see those masks everywhere. Dave wants me to quit the bank. Sarah could understand that. Jennifer's husband worked construction, made decent money, and they had no children yet. The young woman could probably afford to walk away from the job if it meant sleeping better at night. Take some time, Sarah typed back. Don't make any big decisions while you're still processing. It was advice she'd given to dozens of veterans over the past 3 years, men and women struggling with the transition from military to civilian life. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now having to take her own counsel. She was finishing her beer when her neighbor, Tom Bradley, appeared at the fence that separated their properties. Tom was retired from the phone company, a steady man in his 60s whose wife made the best apple pie in 3 counties. "Heard you were at the bank today," he said without preamble. Tom wasn't one for small talk. "Word travels fast. Marge Henderson called my wife. Said you probably saved her life." Sarah looked at the older man, seeing the concern in his weathered face. Tom was a veteran to Vietnam, and they'd developed a friendship based on mutual understanding rather than many words. "How's Mrs. Henderson doing?" "Shaken up. But tough as nails, that one. She wants to thank you properly. Probably cook you enough food to last a month." The thought brought the first smile to Sarah's face since the morning. "I'd like that." Tom was quiet for a moment, studying the sky as the last light faded from the hills. "You know, when I came back from Southeast Asia, I thought the hardest part was behind me. Figured I'd paid my dues, earned my peace and quiet. Took me years to understand that being a soldier isn't something you stop being just because you take off the uniform." "Tom, I'm not saying you went looking for trouble today. But trouble has a way of finding people like us. People who know how to handle it." He turned to look at her directly. "Question is, what are you going to do now that it's found you?" "After." Tom went inside. Sarah remained on the porch until full darkness settled over the valley. The question he'd posed wasn't new. She'd been wrestling with variations of it since the day she'd left the service. What was her role as a civilian? How much of her military training and instincts were assets, and how much were liabilities in a world governed by different rules? In Afghanistan, her purpose had been clear: protect her soldiers, complete the mission, come home alive. The moral calculus had been straightforward, even when the situations were anything but simple. Here, in the quiet complexity of civilian life, the lines were blurred. She'd become involved with the veterans group, partly out of genuine desire to help, but also because it gave her a sense of purpose that her part-time job at the outdoor gear shop couldn't provide. Every Thursday, she sat in a circle of folding chairs in the community center basement, listening to stories of struggle and resilience that mirrored her own experiences. There was Marcus Williams, a Marine who'd lost his left arm to an IED outside Fallujah and was fighting the VA for the prosthetic that would let him return to carpentry work. Janet Ross, an Army medic dealing with nightmares that hadn't faded in the 5 years since her discharge. Bobby Chun, Air Force, whose PTSD had cost him his marriage and his relationship with his teenage daughter. All of them were fighting battles that the civilian world couldn't see or understand. Sarah had become their unofficial leader not because she sought the role, but because she was the only one among them who seemed to have found some measure of peace in the transition. Her service-connected disability check provided enough income to live simply. Her home was paid for thanks to a VA loan, and she'd managed to build something resembling a normal life. Or so she'd thought until 3 masked men had reminded her that normal was a luxury that could disappear in an instant. She went inside and poured herself 2 fingers of bourbon good stuff, a bottle she'd been saving for a special occasion that had never seemed to arrive. The events of the day played in her mind like a tactical debrief, each moment examined for lessons learned and potential improvements. Her response had been instinctive, drawing on training that had become second nature. But Coleman's criticism bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Had she escalated the situation unnecessarily? Could those 3 men have simply taken their money and left without anyone getting hurt? The answer, she knew, lay in details most people hadn't noticed. The cable ties on the 3rd gunman's belt. The way Alpha had kept checking the time, not with the urgency of someone worried about police response, but with the anticipation of someone following a predetermined schedule. The look in his eyes when Jennifer had pleaded for mercy, a coldness that suggested compassion wasn't part of the plan. These men hadn't come to the bank just for money. They'd come for something else, something that required hostages and inside information and a level of local knowledge that suggested they either lived in Cedar Falls or had spent considerable time studying it. Sarah finished her bourbon and headed upstairs to bed, but sleep was elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in the bank lobby, smelling cordite and fear, watching Mrs. Henderson cry silently while a masked man pointed an assault rifle at innocent people. At 3 a.m., she gave up and went to her home office, where she kept detailed maps of the local area, a habit from her military days that had proven useful for planning hiking trips and hunting expeditions. She spread the topographical maps across her desk and began studying the terrain around Cedar Falls. If she were planning an armed robbery, where would she stage from? Where would she go to ground afterward? The state park offered dozens of remote camping areas. The old mining roads in the hills provided access routes that avoiding main highways. There were abandoned farms and hunting cabins scattered throughout the county, places where 3 men with duffel bags full of cash could disappear for weeks or months, but that assumed they were outsiders. If they were locals or working with locals, the possibilities multiplied exponentially. Sarah made coffee and continued her analysis as dawn crept over the hills. She told herself she was just satisfying her curiosity, working through the tactical problem as an intellectual exercise. But deep down she knew better. Tom Bradley had been right. Trouble had found her, and she was already working on finding it right back. The question was no longer whether she would get involved. The question was how far she was willing to go, and what she was willing to risk. To see justice done in the town she'd chosen to call home, the Cedar Falls Community Center sat at the intersection of Oak Street and 3rd Avenue. A brick building constructed in the 1940s that had served as everything from a civil defense headquarters during the Cold War to a temporary shelter during the flood of 1987. On Thursday evenings, its basement became neutral ground for 23 military veterans whose wars spanned 5 decades and 4 continents. Sarah arrived early, as she always did, to arrange the folding chairs in their familiar circle and start the coffee that would fuel 2 hours of conversation, confession, and community. The routine had become sacred to her, a weekly reminder that healing happened one story at a time, one shared understanding at a time. But tonight felt different. News of the bank robbery had spread through Cedar Falls like ripples in still water, and Sarah could feel the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations following her wherever she went. At the grocery store that morning, conversations had stopped when she entered aisles. At the post office, postal clerk had asked 3 times if she was holding up okay after her terrible experience. The first to arrive was Marcus Williams, his prosthetic arm gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Marcus had been Sarah's first real friend in Cedar Falls, a connection forged over shared understanding of what it meant to rebuild your life after losing part of yourself in service to your country. "Hell of a thing at the bank," he said, settling into his usual chair. "Heard you went full operator on those bastards." "I kept my mouth shut and tried not to get anyone killed," Sarah replied, measuring coffee grounds with automatic precision. "Same as anyone else would have done." "Bullshit." The voice belonged to Janet Ross, the former Army medic whose sharp tongue masked a heart that had been broken by too many soldiers she couldn't save. Anyone else would have pissed themselves and prayed. You assessed, adapted, and acted. That's what we do. More veterans filtered in over the next few minutes. Bobby Chen, dealing with divorce papers and custody battles. Alina Vasquez still fighting for recognition of her service-connected hearing loss. David Park, whose TBI from a roadside bomb had ended his career as a high school physics teacher. Each carried their own invisible wounds, their own daily battles with a civilian world that thanked them for their service but rarely understood what that service had cost. The last to arrive was someone Sarah hadn't expected to see. Detective Ray Coleman, still wearing his work clothes, and the tired expression of a man who'd spent the day chasing leads that went nowhere. "Detective," Sarah acknowledged with a nod. "This is unusual. Mind if I sit in? Off the record, of course. I'm Army, 82 to 86. Did my time in Central America when that wasn't supposed to be happening." The group exchanged glances, an unspoken communication that Sarah had learned to read over 3 years of Thursday nights. Veterans were naturally suspicious of law enforcement, especially when their own struggles with authority and civilian bureaucracy were ongoing battles. But Coleman's quiet admission of his own service, and the specific reference to covert operations that many of them understood all too well, shifted the dynamic. "Grab a chair," Marcus said finally. "Coffee's terrible, but it's free." For the first hour, they followed their usual format check-ins. Shared struggles, small victories celebrated, and setbacks acknowledged. Elena had finally received approval for her disability rating increase. Bobby had managed a supervised visit with his daughter that hadn't ended in tears. David had applied for a part-time job at the local library, but the elephant in the room was impossible to ignore, and eventually Marcus addressed it directly. "Sarah, you want to talk about what happened at the bank? Because we've all been there, situations where your training kicks in and you act on instincts most civilians don't understand." Sarah had been dreading this moment, not because she didn't trust the group, but because she wasn't sure she understood her own actions well enough to explain them. In the 60 hours since the robbery, she'd replayed every moment, analyzed every decision, searched for alternative outcomes that might have been possible. "I keep thinking I should have done something different," she said finally. "Maybe if I'd stayed quiet, let them take the money and leave, nobody would have been in danger. And maybe if you'd stayed quiet, we'd be planning Mrs. Henderson's funeral," Janet replied sharply. "You saw something the rest of us didn't, and you acted on it. That's not a character flaw." Detective Coleman had been quiet throughout the discussion, but now he leaned forward slightly. "Can I share something? Off the record, like I said." Sarah nodded, and Coleman continued. "We've been investigating similar robberies in 3 counties over the past 8 months. Same MO inside information, professional execution, no violence until yesterday. But here's the thing, in each case, there were indicators that the perpetrators were planning to eliminate witnesses. Cable ties, extra ammunition, escape routes that suggested they weren't expecting to leave anyone behind to identify them." The room fell silent except for the hum of the ancient heating system and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice water as the implications sank in. "You think they were planning to kill everyone in the bank?" "I think your intervention changed their timeline and forced them to abort before they reached that phase of their operation. The fact that Officer Morrison showed up early probably saved 23 lives, but only because you'd already disrupted their plan." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his prosthetic hand clenching and unclenching, a nervous habit Sarah had noticed during their more difficult discussions. "Jesus, Sarah, you didn't escalate anything. You de-escalated a mass murder." The weight of that realization settled over the room like smoke. Sarah had spent 3 days questioning her actions, wondering if her military training had made her unnecessarily aggressive in a civilian situation. Now she was learning that her instincts had been correct. Those men hadn't come to the bank just for money. "There's something else," Coleman continued. "The other robberies I mentioned, they all targeted banks in small towns, and in each case, the perpetrators had detailed knowledge of local police procedures and banking protocols. We think there's a network involved, possibly including someone in law enforcement or banking. Security. Bobby Chun, who'd been quiet throughout the evening, suddenly spoke up. You think there's a dirty cop involved? Or someone with access to law enforcement communications? The timing of these robberies has been too precise to be coincidental. Sarah's mind was already working through the implications. If there was a conspiracy involving local law enforcement, then Detective Coleman was either part of it or placing himself in significant danger by sharing information with them. The fact that he'd come to a veteran support group to discuss an ongoing investigation suggested he was operating outside normal channels. Why are you telling us this? She asked directly. Coleman met her gaze steadily. Because I think you're still in danger. If these people were planning to eliminate witnesses and you prevented that, they're going to view you as a direct threat. And if there is someone local feeding them information, they'll know exactly where to find you. The words hit the group like a physical blow. Elena Vasquez, whose own experiences with harassment and threats during her military service had left her hyper-vigilant about personal security, was the first to respond. What kind of protection are we talking about? Because small-town cops can't provide 24/7 security, and federal marshals don't get involved unless there's a specific credible threat. There isn't much I can offer officially, Coleman admitted. But unofficially? I'd suggest Sarah vary her routines, stay alert, and consider staying with friends for a while. She can stay with me and Linda, Marcus offered immediately. We've got a guest room, and nobody's getting through me to hurt someone under my roof. The offer touched Sarah more than she could express, but she shook her head. I appreciate it, but I'm not going to put anyone else at risk. If these people want to come after me, they can deal with me directly. That's exactly the kind of thinking that gets heroes killed, Janet said sharply. You don't have to face this alone, Sarah. That's the whole point of what we do here. Nobody fights alone anymore. The discussion continued for another hour, ranging from practical security measures to the psychological impact of living under threat. Creating this detailed analysis and bringing you these complex veteran stories requires significant time and research efforts. If you're finding value in this story, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Sarah found herself both grateful for the support and frustrated by the situation. She'd come to Cedar Falls to find peace, to build a quiet life away from violence and danger. Now she was being told that violence had followed her home. As the meeting wound down and the others prepared to leave, Detective Coleman lingered behind. There's something else I need to tell you, he said once they were alone. Something I couldn't say in front of the group. Sarah finished stacking chairs, her movements automatic while her mind focused on Coleman's tone. Whatever he was about to share, it was significant. We've been monitoring communications, trying to identify the source of the inside information. 3 hours ago, we intercepted a conversation that mentioned you by name. Sarah's hands stilled on the chair she was folding. What kind of conversation? The kind where someone is offering money for information about your daily routines. Where you live, where you work, where you go for groceries. They want to know your patterns, Sarah. That's not the behavior of people who are planning to leave town and forget this ever happened. The community center suddenly felt too large, too exposed, despite its basement location. Sarah's training kicked and automatically sight lines to exits, potential cover positions, assessment of vulnerabilities. She'd thought she was safe in Cedar Falls, but safety was an illusion that could be shattered by 3 men with masks and assault rifles. Who was offering the money? We don't know yet. The communication was encrypted, routed through multiple servers, but the fact that someone is actively seeking intelligence on you means this isn't over. Sarah nodded slowly, her mind already shifting into operational mode. What do you need from me? I need you to be careful. I need you to trust me, which I know is asking a lot given what I've just told you about potential law enforcement involvement. And I need you to understand that sometimes the best way to stay safe is to help us catch the people who are threatening. You want me to be bait." Coleman's silence was answer enough. Sarah finished folding the last chair and turned off the coffee pot. Ordinary actions that felt surreal in the context of their conversation. 6 months ago, her biggest concern had been whether the veterans group would receive continued funding from the county. Now she was discussing becoming bait in an operation to catch armed robbers who wanted her dead. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Don't think too long. These people are getting desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. But they also become more dangerous." After Coleman left, Sarah remained in the empty community center basement, surrounded by folding chairs and the lingering smell of terrible coffee. The walls were decorated with construction paper artwork from the children's programs, bright crayon drawings of houses and families and dogs' innocence preserved in primary colors. She thought about Mrs. Henderson, whose only crime had been trying to deposit her pension check so she could volunteer at her granddaughter's school. About Jennifer Walsh, who was considering quitting her job because she couldn't stop seeing masked faces in every shadow. About Officer Morrison, who'd walked into a situation that could have ended with his death if Sarah hadn't acted when she did. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like familiar armor. She'd spent 3 years trying to leave the war behind, but the war, it seemed, had followed her home. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Beautiful evening for a walk, don't you think? Some people should be more careful about their routines." Sarah stared at the screen, her blood running cold. Someone had been watching her. Someone knew she was at the community center, knew she always stayed late to clean up after the meetings. The message wasn't just a threat, it was a demonstration of how vulnerable she really was. She immediately called Coleman, but the call went straight to voicemail. Fighting down a surge of panic, she made her way to the basement exit, every shadow suddenly potential cover for an attacker. The parking lot was empty except for her truck, sitting under a streetlight that seemed far too dim. The drive home took 15 minutes that felt like hours. Sarah varied her route, taking back roads and making unnecessary turns, watching her mirrors for headlights that might be following too closely. By the time she pulled into her driveway, her hands were shaking. Slightly not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump that came with sustained hypervigilance. Inside her house, she immediately went to her gun safe and retrieved her Glock 19, the same model she'd carried in Afghanistan. The weight of the weapon in her hand was both comforting and troubling, a reminder of skills she'd hoped never to need again. She was checking the locks on her windows when headlights swept across her front yard. Sarah moved to the window, weapon ready, and saw Tom Bradley's pickup truck in his driveway. Her neighbor climbed out slowly, favoring his arthritic knee, and walked to his mailbox. Normal evening routine. Nothing threatening. But the fact that she'd drawn her weapon on a neighbor gathering his mail told her everything she needed to know about her current state of mind. Her phone rang at 11:30 p.m. Coleman's voice was tight with exhaustion, then something that might have been fear. "Sarah, I need you to pack a bag and get out of your house, now." "What's happened?" "We intercepted another communication 30 minutes ago. There's a team moving on your location tonight. I've got units en route, but they're 20 minutes out. And I don't think we have 20 minutes. Sarah was already moving, grabbing the go bag she'd kept packed out of old habit and checking her weapon. "Where do you want me to go?" "Anywhere but there. Drive toward the state police barracks on Route 15, but don't stop until you see my patrol car. And Sarah, if anyone tries to stop you before then, don't stop. Just drive." She was out the door, and in her truck within 3 minutes, her bag thrown in the passenger seat and her Glock within easy reach. As she backed out of her driveway, she saw movement in the woods behind her house, dark shapes that moved with too much purpose to be deer or other wildlife. Sarah floored the accelerator and headed for Route 15. her rearview mirror showing darkness that could hide anything. Her phone GPS estimated 17 minutes to the state police barracks. But 17 minutes was a lifetime when people with guns were hunting you. She'd made it 5 miles when headlights appeared behind her, closing fast. The vehicle was large, probably an SUV, and driving with the kind of aggressive urgency that suggested it wasn't a coincidence. Sarah pressed harder on the accelerator, her truck's V8 engine responding with a growl that she felt through the steering wheel. The speedometer climbed past 60, then 70. Far too fast for the winding county road she was traveling. The SUV behind her matched her speed, then began to gain ground. In her mirrors she could see it was black or dark blue, with tinted windows that made it impossible to see inside. As it drew closer, she caught a glimpse of what might have been a rifle barrel protruding from the passenger window. The first shot starred her rear window, the safety glass holding, but spider webbing across her vision. Sarah yanked the wheel hard right, taking her truck off the pavement and onto the grass shoulder, gravel spraying from her tires as she fought to maintain control. The SUV overshot her position, its driver apparently not expecting her sudden maneuver. Sarah used the momentary advantage to floor the accelerator again, her truck bouncing back onto the asphalt with a jarring impact that she felt in her teeth. She had maybe a 30-second lead, but the SUV was already in reverse, preparing to resume the chase. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She was 10 miles from the state police barracks, on a road with no traffic and limited visibility. Her truck was fast, but not fast enough to outrun a professionally driven pursuit vehicle. What she had instead was knowledge of the local terrain and 15 years of tactical driving experience. 3 miles ahead was an intersection with Old Mill Road, a gravel track that led to an abandoned quarry. The road was narrow, with steep drops on both sides and sharp curves that would favor someone who knew the route over someone who was following blindly. Sarah made the turn at 60 miles per hour, her truck sliding sideways before the tires found purchase on the loose gravel. Behind her, the SUV took the turn too fast and nearly rolled, its driver clearly unfamiliar with the road conditions. The next 2 miles were a nightmare of dust and flying gravel, Sarah's truck bouncing and sliding through turns she'd driven dozens of times during her weekend explorations of the county. The SUV fell further behind, its heavier weight and lower ground clearance working against it on the rough terrain. Sarah knew the road ended at the quarry, a sheer drop into water that was 50 feet deep. She had maybe 2 minutes before she ran out of road entirely. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Coleman's voice was urgent, crackling with static from the poor reception in the hills. "Sarah, where are you? I've got units at your house. But you're not there. Old Mill Road, heading toward the quarry. I've got pursuit, at least one vehicle, and they're shooting." "Jesus. Okay, I'm 10 minutes out, but that road's a dead end." "You need to." The call dropped as Sarah's truck hit a particularly brutal pothole, the impact sending her phone flying into the floorboard. She could see the quarry ahead now, the moonlight reflecting off the still water like a mirror. Sarah slammed on her brakes, her truck sliding to a stop just yards from the edge. Behind her, the SUV was still coming, its headlights growing larger as it navigated the final turn. She had maybe 30 seconds before they reached her position. She grabbed her go bag and her weapon and ran for the tree line, hoping the darkness would provide cover. Behind her, she heard the SUV skid to a stop, doors slamming as at least 2 people got out. "She's on foot." A male voice called out, "Spread out and find her." Sarah moved through the woods with the silence that had kept her alive during night. Patrols in Afghanistan, every step carefully placed to avoid breaking branches or rustling leaves. She could hear her pursuers crashing through the underbrush behind her, their movements loud and clumsy in the darkness. The problem was that she knew exactly where she was and where she needed to go. The old mining road that connected to the quarry access was maybe half a mile through the woods, and from there she could reach the main highway. But half a mile through dense forest in complete darkness was a lifetime. When armed men were hunting you, she'd made it maybe 300 yards when she heard Coleman's voice echoing across the quarry, amplified by a bullhorn. Cedar Falls Police. You are surrounded. Put down your weapons and surrender. The response was immediate gunfire, not the controlled shots of trained professionals, but the panicked automatic fire of people who'd been caught off guard. Sarah dropped behind the fallen log as bullets shredded the trees around her, bark and splinters raining down like deadly confetti. The gunfight lasted maybe 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. Sarah remained motionless behind her cover, listening to the sharp cracks of rifle fire and the deeper booms of police shotguns. Voices shouted commands and warnings, the words lost in the chaos of combat. Then suddenly silence. Sarah! Coleman's voice, closer now. Sarah, if you can hear me, it's safe to come out. She waited another full minute before standing up, her Glock still ready. Through the trees, she could see flashlight beams moving systematically, the careful patterns of law enforcement securing the scene. When she finally emerged from the tree line, she found Coleman standing over 2 men in handcuffs, both bleeding from what appeared to be non-fatal wounds. A third man lay motionless near the SUV, surrounded by paramedics working frantically. You okay? Coleman asked, his face pale in the harsh glare of the emergency lights. I'm fine. What about them? 2 in custody, 1 critical. We'll know more when we get them to the hospital. Coleman looked at the quarry, then back at Sarah. Hell of a thing, leading them up here. Turned a pursuit into a containment operation. Sarah holstered her weapon and accepted the blanket one of the paramedics offered her. The adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving her with the familiar empty feeling that came after violence ended. This isn't over, is it? Coleman shook his head grimly. These were hired muscle, local boys looking for easy money. The people who hired them are still out there, and now they know we're closing in. As they walked back toward the police vehicles, Sarah's phone buzzed with another text from an unknown number. Impressive driving. But you can't run forever. There are people you care about who can't run at all. The message was accompanied by a photograph that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. Mrs. Henderson, sitting in her garden, completely unaware that someone was watching her from the shadows. The war, Sarah realized, had just escalated. The Cedar Falls Police Department had been transformed overnight into something resembling a military command center. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with colored pins that tracked the movements of known associates, potential safe houses, and communication intercepts. Detective Coleman looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours, his usually neat appearance replaced by wrinkled clothes and the haunted expression of a man chasing shadows. Sarah sat across from him in an interview room that smelled of stale coffee and stress sweat, studying photographs of the 3 men who'd tried to kill her 2 nights earlier. 2 were locals, Danny Reeves and Mike Kozlov, both with extensive criminal records and chronic gambling debts. The third, the one who'd died at the quarry, remained unidentified, despite having his fingerprints run through every database available. Professional, Coleman said, tapping the photograph of the dead man. Military or law enforcement background, based on his gear and tactics. Someone brought in outside talent to handle you specifically, because the locals couldn't be trusted to get it done. Because whoever's running this operation understood they were dealing with someone who might shoot back. Coleman leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with the analytical gaze she'd seen him use on crime scenes. The question is how they knew about your background. That information isn't exactly public record. Sarah had been asking herself the same question since the shooting. Her military service was no secret in Cedar Falls, but the specific details of her deployments and training weren't something she discussed casually. Someone had done deep research, into her capabilities and background. I need to ask you something, she said, And I need you to tell me the truth, even if it's not what I want to hear. Coleman nodded. Shoot. How many people in the department know about my service record? The real details, not just Sarah Martinez was in the Army. The detective was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting an internal struggle. 3, maybe 4. Me, Chief Morrison, and whoever ran your background check when you applied for your concealed carry permit. And who ran that background check? Deputy Director Frank Walsh. He handles all the administrative stuff for permits and licenses. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Walsh, as in Jennifer Walsh, her father-in-law. Frank Walsh married into the family, took the name when he married Jennifer's husband's mother. He's been with the sheriff's department for 15 years. Clean record, no red flags. But Sarah was already seeing the connections forming like a tactical overlay on a map. Frank Walsh would have access to detailed background information on anyone applying for permits. He would know police patrol schedules, communication protocols, response times. And he had a personal connection to the bank through his daughter-in-law. Jennifer, I need to talk to Jennifer, Sarah said. Sarah, you can't just, she's in danger. Sarah stood up, her mind already working through the implications. If her father-in-law is involved in this, and she can identify the bank robbers, she's a liability they need to eliminate. Coleman's phone rang before he could respond. The conversation was brief and one-sided, but Sarah could read the tension. In his voice and posture, when he hung up, his face was grim. That was the hospital. Danny Reeves is asking to make a deal. Says he has information about who hired him, but he'll only talk to you. The drive to the county hospital took 20 minutes through morning traffic that felt surreal in its normalcy. People going to work, children waiting for school buses. The ordinary rhythm of a small town that had no idea how close it had come to losing several of its citizens to a conspiracy that reached into the heart of local law enforcement. Danny Reeves looked smaller in the hospital bed than he had in his mugshot. The bravado of a career criminal replaced by the pallor of a man who'd seen his own mortality, reflected in the barrel of a police officer's shotgun. His left arm was in a cast, and bandages covered what appeared to be significant wounds to his shoulder and chest. "You're the lady from the bank," he said when Sarah and Coleman entered his room. It wasn't a question. "I'm the lady who kept you from murdering 23 innocent people," Sarah replied, settling into the plastic chair beside his bed. "Detective Coleman says you want to make a deal." Reeves glanced at Coleman, then back to Sarah. "I want to make sure I live long enough to see my daughter graduate high school. Right now that's looking less and less likely. Who hired you?" "I don't know his real name. Called himself Mr. Smith, paid in cash, always met in different locations. But I know who connected us, who vouched for me and Mike." Reeves paused, wincing as he shifted position. "Frank Walsh, Deputy Director Walsh, set up the introduction, said Mr. Smith needed some local help for a simple job." Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place like a weapon being assembled. "What was your role supposed to be, originally?" "Just lookouts. Watch the bank, report on security procedures, police patrol schedules. Easy money for sitting in a car and taking notes." Reeves' voice was getting weaker, fatigue and pain medication taking their toll. But then the job changed. Mr. Smith said there might be complications, people who needed to be kept quiet permanently. "How many jobs were there before the bank?" "3 that I know of. Banks in Millfield, Cooperstown, and Red Oak. Same pattern every time, inside information. Quick in and out, no witnesses left behind." Coleman leaned forward, his notebook out. "What do you mean, no witnesses?" Reeves closed his eyes, and for a moment Sarah thought he might have lost consciousness. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "They killed everyone. Made it look like the robbers panicked, started shooting when someone tried to be a hero. But it was always planned. Take the money, eliminate the witnesses, disappear. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of medical monitors and the distant sounds of hospital activity. Sarah thought about Mrs. Henderson's trembling hands, Jennifer's tears, the little boy in the Mickey Mouse shirt clinging to his father. All of them had been marked for death from the moment the robbers entered the bank. Why was Cedar Falls different? Coleman asked. Because of her. Reeves looked at Sarah with something that might have been respect. Mr. Smith said there was a potential problem, someone who might not react the way civilians usually do, said we needed to be prepared for resistance. How did he know about me? Walsh provided detailed files on bank employees and regular customers. Your file was flagged as high-risk military background, combat experience, firearms training. Mr. Smith brought in professional help to handle you specifically. Sarah felt a cold rage building in her chest, the controlled fury that had sustained her through firefights and ambush in Afghanistan. These people had turned her into a target simply because she had the skills to protect innocent people. Where is Mr. Smith now? I don't know. After the bank job went wrong, communications stopped. Walsh told us to lay low, said everything would be handled. Next thing I know, Mike and I are getting $5,000 each to make you disappear. Coleman made a note in his book. What about the third man, the one who died at the quarry? Professional contractor. Ex-military, maybe ex-cop. Mr. Smith's insurance policy in case Mike and I screwed up. Reeves coughed, a harsh sound that spoke of internal injuries. Guess we screwed up anyway. Sarah stood up, her mind already moving to the next phase of the operation. Danny, if you're lying about any of this, if you're holding back information that could prevent more people from getting hurt, I will find out. And when I do, police protection won't be enough to keep you safe from me. There was no bluster in her voice, no dramatic threat. Just a simple statement of fact delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who had kept that exact promise before. Reeves nodded weakly. I told you everything I know. Just ... Just make sure my daughter stays. She doesn't know anything about any of this. Outside in the hospital corridor, Coleman was already on his phone, coordinating with the sheriff's department to locate and arrest Frank Walsh. But Sarah's mind was on a different timeline entirely. We need to get to Jennifer, she said as soon as Coleman finished his call. I've already dispatched units to her house and the bank. She be under protection within. No. Sarah's voice cut through his reassurance like a blade. You don't understand. If Walsh is part of this conspiracy, he has access to police communications. He'll know about the units you just dispatched, which means he'll know we're closing in. The implications hit Coleman like a physical blow. Jesus, he'll run, but not before. Not before eliminating the last witness who can connect him to the bank robbery. We need to get to Jennifer now, before he realizes how much we know. They made the drive to Jennifer's house in 8 minutes, Coleman's patrol car eating up the distance with lights and sirens. But as they pulled into the driveway of the modest ranch home on Elm Street, Sarah could see that they were already too late. The front door stood open, moving slightly in the morning breeze. Jennifer's car was in the driveway, but there was no sign of life inside the house. Coleman drew his weapon as they approached the door. Sarah closed behind him with her own Glock ready. Jennifer? Coleman called out. Cedar Falls Police. Ah. You okay? The silence that answered was profound and terrifying. They cleared the house room by room, finding signs of a struggle in the kitchen overturned chairs. A broken coffee mug, Jennifer's purse spilled across the floor. But no Jennifer, and no indication of where she might have been taken. Sarah was examining the scene when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Miss Martinez, I believe you have something that belongs to me. The young lady will remain safe as long as you're willing to discuss a reasonable exchange. Old Mill Quarry, 1 hour. Come alone, or she dies. Coleman read the message over her shoulder, his face grim. It's a trap. Classic hostage exchange scenario designed to lure you into an isolated location. Of course it's a trap, Sarah replied, checking her weapon and spare magazines. But it's also our only chance to save Jennifer and end this. Sarah, you can't. I can, and I will. She turned to face Coleman directly, seeing her own determination reflected in his tired eyes. This started because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. It ends because I choose to be in the right place at the right time. Coleman was quiet for a moment, studying her with the expression of a man weighing impossible choices. What do you need from me? Give me 30 minutes before you move any units. I need time to assess the situation and find Jennifer before this becomes a tactical situation with a civilian in the crossfire. And if it's already a tactical situation? Sarah's smile was cold and predatory, the expression of a Marine who'd hunted insurgents through the mountains of Afghanistan. Then these people are about to discover why the Army spent 2 years teaching me how to kill professionally. As she drove toward the quarry for the second time in 3 days, Sarah's mind was clear and focused in a way it hadn't been since she'd left the service. The doubt and second-guessing that had plagued her civilian life evaporated, replaced by the crystalline certainty of mission focus. She was going to save Jennifer Walsh. She was going to end the threat to her community. And she was going to remind Frank Walsh and his mysterious partner that some people should never be hunted. The war had followed her home. But Sarah Martinez was finally ready to finish it. The old mill quarry looked different in daylight, less ominous, more like the abandoned industrial site it actually was. Sarah parked her truck at the same spot where her pursuit had ended 3 nights earlier, noting the tire tracks and scuff marks that told the story of desperate men making desperate choices. The morning sun painted the still water in shades of gold and amber, beautiful and deceptive. She'd arrived 15 minutes early, using the extra time to conduct reconnaissance that had become second nature during her years in Afghanistan. 2 vehicles were hidden in the tree line, a black SUV that matched the description of the one that had pursued her, and Frank Walsh's personal pickup truck. At least 2 hostiles, possibly more. Sarah moved through the woods with the silent precision that had kept her alive during night raids in Kandahar, every step calculated to avoid detection. The quarry's edge provided natural concealment, and she used it to get within 50 yards of the meeting site before settling into a position that offered clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. Through her rifle scope she'd retrieved her hunting rifle from home before making the drive, she could see Jennifer Walsh tied to a chair near the water's edge, her face pale but alert. 30 yards away, Frank Walsh paced nervously, checking his watch every few seconds. The third man she couldn't see, but his position was betrayed by cigarette smoke rising from behind a stack of old mining equipment. Sarah's phone buzzed. "You're late." "Ms. Martinez, I'm not a patient man," she replied. "I'm here. Let me see that Jennifer is unharmed, then we'll talk." Below, she watched Walsh walk over to Jennifer and remove what appeared to be duct tape from her mouth. Even at a distance, Sarah could see the young woman was frightened but trying to maintain composure. "Sarah?" Jennifer's voice carried clearly across the quarry. "Sarah, don't do this. It's a trap." Walsh backhanded her casually, the sound of the blow echoing off the quarry walls. Sarah's finger tightened on her rifle's trigger, but she forced herself to remain patient. One shot would alert the third man, potentially getting Jennifer killed before Sarah could neutralize all threats. Her phone buzzed again. "As you can see, Ms. Walsh is alive and relatively unharmed. How long she remains that way depends on your cooperation. I want the information you provided to Detective Coleman, all of it." Sarah typed back. "What information?" "Don't play games. I know Danny Reeves talked to you at the hospital. I want to know exactly what he said, and I want any evidence he might have provided." The exchange confirmed what Sarah had suspected. Walsh had been monitoring police communications, tracking their investigation in real time. It also told her that he didn't know the full extent of what Reeves had revealed, which meant there was still hope of salvaging the operation. "I'm coming down," she texted. "When I reach the clearing, you release Jennifer. Then we can discuss terms." She waited for his response. "No weapons. I see a gun. The girl dies." Sarah left her rifle concealed in the rocks and began working her way down toward the quarry floor, her Glock tucked into the small of her back beneath her jacket. As she emerged from the tree line, Walsh stepped into view, a pistol in his hand, pointed casually in Jennifer's direction. "Ms. Martinez, we meet at last under less than ideal circumstances." Frank Walsh was a man in his 50s, average height and build, with the soft appearance of someone who'd spent too many years behind a desk. But his eyes held the cold calculation of a killer, and Sarah recognized the type bureaucrats who'd found ways to profit from violence without getting their own hands dirty. "Let her go," Sarah said, stopping 20 feet away from Jennifer's chair. "She doesn't know anything that can hurt you. On the contrary, she knows everything. She was our source inside the bank, though she didn't realize it at the time." Walsh's smile was ugly, self-satisfied. Amazing how much information people will share with family members they trust. Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. "You used her. Got information about security procedures, cash delivery schedules, employee routines." She thought she was just making conversation with her father-in-law. "Jennifer is a very trusting young woman and talkative. She mentioned your frequent visits to the bank, your military background, your heroic tendencies. When my business partner expressed concern about potential complications, I was able to provide very detailed intelligence." "Your business partner being Mr. Smith?" Walsh's laugh was harsh. "Mr. Smith is a fiction, a convenient identity for someone who prefers to remain anonymous. Let's just say he's someone with significant resources and very specific needs." Behind the mining equipment, Sarah caught a glimpse of movement, the third man repositioning himself for a better angle. She was running out of time before this became a shooting situation with Jennifer in the crossfire. "What do you want, Walsh?" "I want the investigation stopped. I want Danny Reeves to suffer an unfortunate accident before he can provide any additional information. And I want you to disappear permanently this time. And in exchange, Jennifer lives. Jennifer dies regardless. She knows too much, and she's seen too much. The only question is whether she dies quickly or slowly, and whether you die with her." The admission confirmed what Sarah had known from the moment she'd received the text message. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution disguised as an exchange. Walsh had never intended to let either of them walk away alive, which meant Sarah was free to implement her real plan. "You made one mistake, Walsh," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the quarry. "Really? What's that?" "You assumed I came here alone." The words were a signal, and Detective Coleman's voice boomed across the quarry from a bullhorn. "Cedar Falls Police, drop your weapons and step away from the hostage." Walsh spun toward the sound, his weapon swinging away from Jennifer. For just a moment, it was the opening Sarah had been waiting for. She drew her Glock and put 2 rounds center mass into Walsh's chest before he could bring his pistol back around. The deputy director dropped like a marionette with cut strings, his weapon skittering. Across the rocky ground dot, the third man immediately opened fire from his concealment, muzzle flashes strobing from behind the mining equipment. Sarah dove for cover behind Jennifer's chair, using her own body to shield the young woman from the incoming rounds. "Stay down," she shouted, working to untie Jennifer's restraints while bullets chewed up the ground around them. The gunfight lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. Coleman and at least 3 other officers had surrounded the quarry, their coordinated fire forcing the hidden gunman to keep his head down. Sarah used the distraction to free Jennifer and get her to better cover behind a large boulder near the water's edge. "Sarah," Jennifer sobbed, clinging to her rescuer with shaking hands. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I thought I was just talking to family. It's not your fault, Sarah replied, keeping her weapon trained on the mining equipment where the third man had taken cover. None of this is your fault. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had started. Coleman's voice echoed across the quarry. Suspect down. All units, suspect is down. In the sudden silence that followed, Sarah could hear sirens approaching ambulances. More police units, probably FBI given the interstate nature of the crimes. The quarry would soon be swarming with law enforcement and investigators. The quiet isolation replaced by the controlled chaos of a major crime scene. As they waited for the all-clear signal, Jennifer looked at Sarah with eyes that held a mix of gratitude and guilt. How did you know? How did you know to bring the police? I didn't come here to negotiate, Sarah admitted. I came here to end this. The text message gave us Walsh's location, and Coleman positioned his team while I provided distraction. Sometimes the best way to save a hostage is to make the hostage takers think they're in control. The next 6 hours were a blur of interviews, crime scene processing, and paperwork. The third gunman identified as Marcus Cole, a former police officer from 3 states away, had been wounded but would survive to face trial. A search of his vehicle turned up detailed files on the previous bank robberies, confirming the pattern of murder that had been disguised as robbery gone wrong. But it was the discovery in Frank Walsh's pickup truck that provided the biggest revelation. A laptop computer containing encrypted communications with someone identified only as the director. The messages painted a picture of a criminal organization that specialized in providing inside information for high-value robberies, using corrupt law enforcement and banking officials to identify targets and plan operations. Detective Coleman found Sarah sitting on a bench outside the police station as the sun was setting, a styrofoam cup of terrible coffee growing cold in her hands. How are you holding up? He asked, settling beside her with his own cup. I keep thinking about the other banks, she said. How many people died because I wasn't there to disrupt their plans? You can't think like that. You can't take responsibility for crimes that happened before you knew they existed. Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the evening traffic on Main Street, people heading home from work, stopping at the grocery store, living their ordinary lives in a town that had no idea how close it had come to tragedy. The FBI wants to offer me a consulting position, she said finally. Help them track down the rest of this network, identify other corrupt officials who might be involved. That's quite an honor. What did you tell them? I told them I'd think about it. Sarah sipped her coffee, making a face at the bitter taste. 3 days ago, I thought I wanted nothing more than to live quietly, tend my garden, help a few veterans navigate their paperwork. Now I'm not sure what I want. Coleman nodded, understanding. Sometimes life doesn't give us the choice to stay on the sidelines. Sometimes we're called to serve again, just in different ways. As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus Williams appeared in the parking lot, walking toward them with his distinctive gait. Behind him came the rest of the Thursday night veterans group: Janet Ross, Bobby Chun, Alina Vasquez, and David Park. Figured you might need some backup, Marcus said, settling onto the bench across from them. Heard today was pretty intense. How did you? Small town, Janet interrupted. News travels fast, especially when one of our own is involved in a shootout with corrupt cops. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of shared quiet that veterans understood better than civilians. No need for explanations or justifications, just the presence of people who understood what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, to make the hard choices that others couldn't or wouldn't make. So what happens now? Bobby asked eventually. Now we heal, Sarah said. The town, the bank employees, Jennifer. We help them process what happened and move forward. And you? Alina's question was gentle but persistent. Sarah considered the two questions seriously. I think I'm going to take that FBI consulting job. Not permanently, but long enough to help them shut down this network completely. Make sure no other small towns have to go through what Cedar Falls almost went through. Marcus nodded approvingly. Once a Marine, always a Marine. Different mission, same commitment. As the group began to disperse, heading home to families and evening routines, Detective Coleman lingered behind. "Sarah, there's something else you should know. The laptop we found in Walsh's truck? It contained financial records showing payments to a dozen other law enforcement officials across 3 states. This thing was bigger than we imagined." "How much bigger?" "Big enough that the FBI is creating a task force specifically to investigate it. Big enough that they're going to need someone who understands both law enforcement and military tactics." Coleman paused, studying her face in the fading light. "Big enough that if you say yes to their offer, you'll be hunting bad guys for a lot longer than a consulting contract." Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility settling on her shoulders, but this time it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. "Good," she said simply. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Cedar Falls Community Center, addressing a packed room that included not just veterans but family members, city officials, and representatives from 3 federal agencies. The Thursday night meetings had evolved into something larger, a comprehensive support network that helped military families navigate everything from PTSD treatment to job placement to housing assistance. "When I first came to Cedar Falls," she told the assembled crowd, "I thought I was done fighting. I thought I'd earned my peace and quiet. What I learned is that peace isn't something you earn once and keep forever. It's something you protect, actively and continuously, for yourself and for the people you care about." In the front row, Mrs. Henderson sat with her granddaughter Emma, now 9 years old and volunteering as Sarah's assistant for the evenings. Presentation. Jennifer Walsh sat nearby, her husband Dave holding her hand as she continued her recovery from the trauma of her kidnapping. Detective Coleman, recently promoted to chief of police following his exemplary handling of the corruption investigation, nodded approvingly from his seat near the back. "The network we uncovered that day at the quarry extended across 7 states and involved 43 law enforcement officials," Sarah continued. "In the 18 months since the investigation began, we've prevented an estimated 32 robberies and saved hundreds of lives. But more importantly, we've restored faith in the institutions that are supposed to protect us." The FBI task force had been Sarah's life for the past year and a half. Working alongside federal agents and local law enforcement, she'd helped develop new protocols for identifying and investigating corruption within police departments. The techniques they'd pioneered in response to the Cedar Falls case were now being implemented nationwide, creating safeguards that would prevent criminal networks from infiltrating law enforcement. "The work isn't finished," Sarah said, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. "Evil doesn't take vacations, and neither can those of us committed to fighting it. But that's why we build communities like this one, so that no one has to stand watch alone." After the presentation, as the crowd mingled over coffee and the cookies that Mrs. Henderson still insisted on baking for every community event, Sarah found herself in conversation with a young woman she didn't recognize. The stranger was perhaps 25, with the barren and alertness that Sarah had learned to associate with military service. "Ms. Martinez? I'm Lieutenant Emily Carter, Army Rangers. I just finished my 2nd deployment in Syria, and I'm rotating back to civilian life next month." Sarah shook the young woman's hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that spoke of confidence and competence. "What brings you to Cedar Falls, Lieutenant? I heard about what you've built here. The Veterans Program, the community outreach, the way you've managed to create something meaningful after service." Emily paused, her expression serious. "I was hoping you might have room for one more person who's trying to figure out what comes next." The question took Sarah back 3 years, to her own uncertainty, and search for purpose in a world that seemed to have no place for the skills she developed in uniform. Looking at Emily Carter, she saw herself a warrior trying to find a way to serve in peacetime. "We always have room for people who want to make a difference," Sarah replied. "But I should warn you, life in Cedar Falls isn't as quiet as it used to be." Emily's smile was sharp and determined. Good, quiet was getting boring anyway. As the evening wound down and the last of the attendees made their way home, Sarah found herself alone in the community center with Detective now Chief Coleman. They worked together to stack chairs and clean up the coffee station, a routine they'd developed over dozens of similar events. "Emily Carter seems like good people," Coleman observed as he wiped down tables. "Rangers usually are. She reminds me of myself at that age looking for a mission, a way to stay useful." Sarah paused in her chair stacking to look at Coleman directly. "Ray, I need to tell you something. The FBI has offered me a permanent position heading up there. New Anti-Corruption Task Force. Based in Washington, full federal agent status, significant resources." Coleman's hands stilled on the table he was cleaning. "That's quite an opportunity. What did you tell them?" "I told them I needed time to think about it. The work is important, critical, really. But taking the job would mean leaving Cedar Falls, leaving all of this." She gestured around the community center, encompassing not just the building but everything it represented. "Sarah, you can't make career decisions based on what a small town needs from you. You've got to think about what's best for your future. This town saved my life," Sarah said quietly. "Not in any dramatic way, but in all the small ways that matter. It gave me purpose when I thought I'd lost mine permanently. It gave me a community when I thought I was destined to be alone. The question is whether I can serve that community better by staying here or by taking the fight to a national level." Coleman finished cleaning his table and turned to face her fully. "You know what I think? I think you're asking the wrong question." "What do you mean?" "You're acting like this is an either or choice: stay in Cedar Falls or take the FBI job. But what if it's not? What if there's a third option you haven't considered?" Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Coleman's radio crackled to life. "Chief Coleman, we've got a situation at the First National Bank. Silent alarm was triggered, and we can't reach anyone inside." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. "The bank, again." Coleman was already moving toward the door, his hand instinctively checking his weapon. "Sarah, I need you to. I'm coming with you," she said, her voice allowing no argument. "Sarah, you're not law enforcement. You can't just Ray." She looked at him with the calm certainty that had carried her through 2 deployments and a dozen life-or-death situations. How did that work out last time? The drive to the bank took 4 minutes that felt like 40. Sarah's mind automatically shifted into tactical mode, assessing possibilities and preparing for various scenarios. It could be a false alarm. Banks were notorious for sensitive security systems. It could be a legitimate robbery by opportunistic criminals with no connection to the previous incident. Or it could be something worse. As they pulled into the bank parking lot, Sarah could see that the building appeared normal from the outside. Lights were on, no signs of struggle or violence. But something felt wrong, the same instinctive unease that had saved her life in Afghanistan. 2 units are en route, Coleman said into his radio. ETA 3 minutes. I want a perimeter established, but nobody moves on the building until I give the word. Sarah was studying the bank's facade when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A figure moving past one of the interior windows. Someone wearing what appeared to be body armor and carrying a long weapon. "Ray, we've got hostiles inside. At least one, possibly more, and they're heavily armed." Coleman followed her gaze and saw the same thing. "Shit, Sarah, I need you to get back." His words were cut off by the sound of automatic gunfire from inside the bank, followed immediately by screaming. Sarah was moving before she consciously made the decision, her body responding to the sound of people in mortal danger. Sarah, no. But she was already running toward the bank's side entrance, knowing it would be unlocked during business hours. Behind her, she could hear Coleman calling for backup and SWAT, but backup was minutes away, and the people inside didn't have minutes. Sarah drew her Glock and moved through the familiar layout with silent precision. The shooting had stopped, but she could hear voices, at least 2 men, possibly 3, speaking in urgent whispers. Through a gap in the partition, she could see the lobby area where, 3 years earlier, she'd first encountered the reality that her war wasn't over. This time was different. This time, she was ready. 3 men in tactical gear held positions. Throughout the lobby, their weapons trained on a group of customers and employees who lay face down on the marble floor. But something was wrong with the scene. The robbers' positioning was all wrong for a bank robbery. Too spread out. Too focused on containment rather than accessing the vault. This wasn't a robbery. This was something else entirely. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Martinez, I believe you know why we're here. You have something that belongs to our organization, and we've come to collect it. You have 5 minutes to present yourself, or we start executing hostages." The message confirmed what Sarah had begun to suspect. This wasn't a random crime. It was a targeted operation designed to draw her out. Someone from the larger criminal network had come to finish what Frank Walsh had started. She texted back, "I'm here. What do you want?" The response came immediately, the encryption keys from Walsh's laptop. "We know you copied them before turning the computer over to the FBI. We want those keys, and we want you to disappear permanently. In exchange, these people live." Sarah had indeed copied the encryption keys before handing over Walsh's laptop, a precaution that had seemed wise at the time, but now made her a target for the surviving members of the criminal network. The keys would allow access to financial records and communication logs. That could implicate dozens of other corrupt officials. She was composing her response when she heard a sound that made her heart stop. Mrs. Henderson's voice, shaky but defiant. "You leave her alone. Sarah Martinez is a hero, and if you think the people of this town are going to let you hurt her, you're more foolish than you look." The sound of a blow being struck echoed through the lobby, followed by Mrs. Henderson's cry of pain. Sarah felt rage building in her chest, not the hot anger that led to mistakes, but the cold fury that had sustained her through the darkest moments of combat. These people had made a fatal error. They'd threatened her community, her chosen family. They'd brought violence to innocent people who wanted nothing more than to live their quiet lives in peace. Sarah Martinez had spent 3 years trying to leave the war behind. Now the war had come home, and she was going to end it once and for all. Sarah moved through the bank like a predator stalking prey, her training and instincts merging into something primal and deadly. She'd memorized the building's layout years ago, knew every corner and blind spot, every angle that could provide concealment or advantage. The first gunman never saw her coming. She approached from his 6 o'clock, using the noise of his own breathing and the ambient sounds of the building to mask her movement. The tactical knife she'd carried in Afghanistan found the space between his body armor panels with surgical precision, dropping him silently to the carpeted floor behind the teller counter. 1 down, 2 to go. The second gunman was positioned near the vault, his attention focused on the hostages rather than perimeter security. Sarah's approach was methodical, patient, using the bank's internal architecture to remain invisible until the moment she struck. This one she took with a blood choke, applied with the kind of precision that came from years of close quarters combat training. The third gunman realized something was wrong when his partner stopped responding to radio calls. Sarah could hear him moving through the lobby, his footsteps betraying both urgency and uncertainty. "Martinez." His voice echoed through the building. "I know you're in here. Show yourself, or I start killing hostages." To emphasize his point, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of a round being chambered into an assault rifle. Through the partition, she could see him standing over Mrs. Henderson, The weapon's barrel inches from the elderly woman's head. Sarah made her choice. She stepped into the lobby with her hands visible, her Glock holstered, but easily accessible. The remaining gunman was young, maybe 25, with the kind of aggressive posture that spoke of training, but not experience. "Here I am," she said calmly. "Let's talk. Where are my partners? Sleeping. Permanently." Sarah's voice carried no emotion, just statement of fact. "Which means it's just you and me now. You can walk away from this, or you can join them. Your choice." The gunman's weapon swung toward her, but his hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline and fear making him unpredictable. "I want those encryption keys, now. The keys are in my truck, parked outside. Let these people go, and I'll get them for you. You think I'm stupid? You go outside, and every cop in the county will be waiting for me." Sarah nodded toward the windows where flashing lights were already visible in the parking lot. "They're already waiting. The question is whether you want to face them alone, or whether you want to face them with 23 hostages and a murder. Charge." The young man's eyes darted toward the windows, confirming what Sarah had hoped. He was inexperienced, easily distracted. She used his momentary inattention to close the distance between them, moving with the fluid speed that had kept her alive in urban combat. The disarming technique was textbook perfect. Control the weapon, break the opponent's balance, apply overwhelming force to vulnerable joints. The gunman hit the marble floor hard, his rifle clattering away across the lobby as Sarah zip-tied the unconscious gunman with restraints she'd taken from his equipment. The bank's front doors burst open, and Chief Coleman led a team of officers into the building. The tactical entry was smooth and professional, but unnecessary. The immediate threat had been neutralized. "Jesus, Sarah," Coleman said as he surveyed the scene. "How many?" "3 total, 2 KIA, 1 for booking." She gestured toward the bound gunman. "You'll want to check them for identification and any intelligence that might lead to other network members." As paramedics attended to the hostages and crime scene technicians began processing evidence, Sarah found herself sitting on the same marble floor where she'd knelt 3 years earlier, watching the familiar chaos of a law enforcement response. Mrs. Henderson approached her slowly, a butterfly bandage covering a cut on her cheek, but her eyes bright with determination. "Sarah, dear, I wanted to thank you. Again." "Mrs. Henderson, I'm so sorry you had to go through this. I'm sorry my past brought danger to." The elderly woman held up a hand, cutting off Sarah's apology. "Nonsense. You didn't bring danger to our town, you brought justice. There's a difference." As the evening wore on and the last of the evidence was collected, Sarah found herself in Coleman's office for what felt like the 100th debriefing in 3 years. But this time felt different, final, somehow. "The FBI wants a full report by morning," Coleman said, settling behind his desk with a cup of coffee that was probably his 10th of the day. "They're particularly interested in how these people knew about the encryption keys." "There's a leak somewhere in the task force," Sarah replied. "Has to be. The existence of those keys was compartmented information, known to maybe 6 people. Total, including you." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Including me. But if I wanted to sell information to criminal networks, I wouldn't do it by staging elaborate hostage situations in my own hometown." Coleman's smile was tired but genuine. Point taken. "So what's next? Still thinking about that Washington job?" "Actually, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about there being a third option I hadn't considered." "And?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling a certainty she hadn't experienced in months. "What if the choice isn't between staying in Cedar Falls or joining the FBI? What if it's about bringing federal resources to small towns like this one?" Coleman raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "A regional task force, based right here in Cedar Falls. Small enough to be responsive to local needs, big enough to handle multi-jurisdictional investigations. Federal funding, local implementation, community partnership. The idea had been percolating in Sarah's mind for weeks, but speaking it aloud made it feel real, achievable. She could see the possibilities unfolding, a new model for law enforcement that combined federal resources with local knowledge and community trust. The Bureau would go for that? They might, especially after tonight. This case has demonstrated that criminal networks don't respect jurisdictional boundaries, but neither do they account for local knowledge and community relationships. What we did here tonight, it worked because we understood the terrain, the people, the stakes. Coleman was quiet for a moment, studying her with the analytical expression she'd learned to associate with his decision-making process. You know. What? I think you might be onto something. And I think I know someone who might be interested in helping you make it happen. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in the conference room of the Cedar Falls City Hall, addressing a group that included FBI Assistant Director Patricia Monroe, State Police Colonel James Burke, and Mayor Elizabeth Santos. The presentation board behind her displayed organizational charts, budget projections, and case studies that demonstrated the effectiveness of community-based federal task forces. The Cedar Falls Regional Anti-Corruption Task Force would serve a 7-county area, Sarah explained, providing federal investigative resources while maintaining the community connections that have made our recent operations successful. Assistant Director Monroe leaned forward, her expression skeptical but interested. Agent Martinez, what you're proposing is essentially a new model for federal law enforcement. The Bureau doesn't typically establish permanent field offices in towns of 8,000 people. With respect, ma'am, the Bureau also doesn't typically deal with criminal networks that specifically target small towns because they assume federal resources won't be available to investigate them. Sarah clicked to the next slide, showing statistics that painted a sobering picture of rural crime rates and conviction percentages. Criminal organizations have learned to exploit the resource gap between urban and rural law enforcement. They assume that small-town police departments can't match their sophistication, and they're usually right. What we're proposing changes that calculation. Colonel Burke nodded approvingly. The state police would certainly support such an initiative. We've seen the same patterns. Agent Martinez is describing sophisticated criminal operations, specifically targeting rural communities. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, covering everything from budget allocations to staffing requirements to political considerations. By the end, Sarah could see that she'd made her case. The proposal would require approvals at multiple levels, but the foundation had been laid. As the officials filed out of the conference room, Assistant Director Monroe lingered behind. Agent Martinez, I have to ask, are you sure about this? Washington would offer you significant opportunities for advancement, chances to work on cases with national significance. Sarah looked out the conference room window, across Main Street to Henderson's Flowers, where Mrs. Henderson was arranging a display of autumn mums with her granddaughter Emma. The scene was peaceful, ordinary, and infinitely precious. Ma'am, I've learned that significance isn't measured by the size of the case or the location of the assignment. It's measured by the impact you have on the people who depend on you. Monroe smiled, the expression transforming her stern features. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need more of in federal law enforcement. Consider your proposal approved, pending final budget authorization. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the basement of the Cedar Falls Community Center, but the space had been transformed. Where folding chairs had once created an intimate circle for veterans meetings, now there were computer workstations, communication equipment, and a wall-mounted display showing active investigations across 7 counties. The Cedar Falls Regional Task Force had become reality, staffed by a mix of federal agents, state police investigators, and local law enforcement officers. The Thursday night veterans meetings still happened, but now they included spouses, family members, and community leaders who'd become part of an expanded support network. Emily Carter, Now a federal agent assigned to the task force approached Sarah with a file folder that contained their latest case. "We've got another one," Emily said, her expression grim. "Small bank in Millfield, same AO as the original robberies. Local police chief thinks it might be connected to our network." Sarah accepted the file, already mentally shifting into operational mode. The work never ended. As fast as they shut down one criminal operation, another seemed to take its place. But that was the nature of the job, the reality of standing watch against the darkness. What's our timeline? The robbery happened 3 hours ago. Local PD has the scene secured, but they're requesting federal assistance with the investigation. Sarah nodded, gathering her equipment and preparing for another deployment. As she headed for the door, she caught sight of a photograph on her desk, the Thursday night veterans group from 5 years earlier, when she'd been just another wounded warrior trying to find her place in the world. Marcus Williams was in the photo, his prosthetic arm gleaming under the camera flash. Janet Ross stood beside him, her medical training now employed as the task force's trauma counselor. Bobby Chun had reconciled with his daughter and was working as the group's family liaison. Elena Vasquez used her legal expertise to help veterans navigate the system. David Park had found new purpose teaching tactical planning to law enforcement agencies. All of them had found ways to transform their pain into purpose, their wounds into wisdom. The Thursday night meetings had evolved into something none of them could have imagined. A genuine community of healing that extended far beyond the original circle of folding chairs. As Sarah drove toward Millfield, her radio crackled with updates from other task force members. Detective, now Deputy Chief Coleman, was coordinating with state police. Agent Monroe was monitoring federal intelligence channels. The entire network of relationships and resources that had grown from 3 masked men in a bank lobby was now deployed to prevent other communities from experiencing the same trauma. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her greatest victory had come not from leaving her past behind, but from embracing it fully. The skills that had sustained her in Afghanistan, the instincts that had saved her life in combat, the training that had seemed like a burden in civilian life, all of it had found new purpose in service to her chosen community. She thought about the young Rangers and Marines and soldiers who would eventually find their way to Cedar Falls, carrying their own invisible wounds and searching for their own sense of purpose. The task force had created internship programs, mentorship opportunities, pathways for veterans to transition their military skills into meaningful civilian careers. The work was far from finished. There would be more banks, more criminals, more innocent people caught in the crossfire of violence they didn't understand. But there would also be more communities prepared to stand together, more networks of support and protection, more people willing to step forward when courage was required. As Sarah's radio crackled with reports from the scene in Millfield, she felt the familiar surge of purpose that had sustained her through 2 deployments and a dozen life-or-death situations. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. She was still a Marine, still a Guardian, still standing watch. She was just doing it in a place where silence was never forgotten, where community meant protection, and where ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the situation demanded it. The war had followed her home, but she'd learned to fight it on her own terms, surrounded by people who understood that freedom wasn't free and peace required vigilance. Cedar Falls had saved her life, and now she spent every day returning the favor. Behind her, the sun was setting over the hills that surrounded her chosen home, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that reminded her why some things were worth fighting for. Ahead, the lights of Millfield marked another community that needed protection, another chance to make a difference. Sarah Martinez had found her mission at last. And this time she wasn't fighting alone. Subscribe to our channel, where silence is never forgotten.